Welcome to Humanity's Values, a podcast celebrating the exploration of relational living. My name is David Teachout, relational living mentor and therapist for Life Weavings, LLC. For further information on this podcast, including recommended books for personal exploration and blog entries covering topics of psychology, spirituality, and human relationships, please visit lifeweavings.org. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you're as excited as I am to continue this journey of exploring our humanity. This podcast is an attempt at creating a relationship with you, where sharing my reflections on humanity and spirituality begins a dialogue about how we live our lives. For many of us, myself included, we've struggled with defining our purpose, wrestled with ideas large and small, and in many different ways stumbled through that journey weighted down by the rigid structures of certain religions and other limiting ideologies. I, for one, was quite happy to leave fundamentalism behind, and after several years I realized I could remove the traps of other authoritarian systems as well. I could do this within a love of humanity and a desire to explore questions of meaning and purpose. I don't expect that we'll always be in agreement, but I do bring myself ready and willing to ask questions, explore ideas, and dive into what we value. Today's reading, I will be covering The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung. It is a collection of essays written by Jung covering the relationship between individual and society. And I was introduced to this book recently by a colleague of mine who I work with, and was immediately enraptured by Jung's incisive commentary on what was going on then and how it pertains to what is going on now, despite it occurring 50 or 60 years previous to now. And I think one of the reasons for this is not that history repeats itself, but rather humanity is constantly at odds within itself, drawn as it is to what is often looked at as competing forces. On one side you have the individual, on the other you have society, and people find themselves caught in this kind of tug-of-war match, and often in ways that are not always so clear. And these questions of what is it to be myself? What is it to be autonomous, free will, morality? What is the proper relationship that one has to one's family, to one's society, to one's country? What role does patriotism play? What role does a nationalistic ethos or philosophy play a role in individual action? All of these questions, in various forms, have troubled us, have moved us in varying directions throughout all of human history. And this is Jung's kind of exploration of that and what that may mean. I'll be covering chapter 1 with several readings from that, sections out of it. And I definitely encourage you to pick up a copy. A link to it can be found at the podcast page of lifeweavings.org, right underneath the episode title here. This is episode 9, Forgetting the Individual for the Safety of the Crowd. Again, if you have any questions that come out of that reading, by all means, send them on over. I'd be more than happy to come back and cover more of this rather fascinating book. Okay, so we will begin our reading. What will the future bring? From time immemorial, this question has occupied men's minds, though not always to the same degree. Historically, it is chiefly in times of physical, political, economic, and spiritual distress that men's eyes turn with anxious hope to the future, and when anticipations, utopias, and apocalyptic visions multiply. One thinks, for instance, of the chiliastic expectations of the Augustan age at the beginning of the Christian era, or of the changes in the spirit of the West which accompanied the end of the first millennium. Today, as the end of the second millennium draws near, we are again living in an age filled with apocalyptic images of universal destruction. All right, so that's the one paragraph there, right in the beginning, where Jung is setting up the initial point that he's going to consider. Reading this, one can be easily forgiven for forgetting that this was 60 years ago. All anybody has to do is turn on, their favorite news channel, or boot up their computer and look at whatever website they've decided to get their news to support their worldview from. And you'll find obviously different versions of it, but regardless, you'll still find protests and declarations that because of somebody else doing their thing, we're seeing the very core of society, the very core of our civilization is in jeopardy. Whereas in Jung's time, you had the Cold War. In our time, we have, in a fit of irony, democracy, which has delivered unto itself various leaders throughout the world that, to many, are harbingers of the end of this great experiment. And it is precisely when such language starts being used that we find ourselves struggling even more so with questions of the future, with questions of what our individual role is in it, because we are in this moment of extreme change, of huge upheaval. It is understandable that we begin to question, wait, these things are happening at a level of society and government that typically doesn't bother us. But because the changes are perceived to be so huge, because technology has made the world smaller, then our relationship to these struggles becomes all the more pertinent, all the more meaningful. Okay, and returning to Jung, the gift of reason and critical reflection is not one of man's outstanding peculiarities, and even where it exists, it proves to be wavering and inconstant, the more so as a rule the bigger the political groups are. The mass crushes out the insight and reflection that are still possible with the individual, and this necessarily leads to doctrinaire and authoritarian tyranny if ever the constitutional state should succumb to a fit of weakness. Rational argument can be conducted with some prospect of success only so long as the emotionality of a given situation does not exceed a certain critical degree. We have no reason to take this threat lightly. Even where in the West there are subversive minorities who, sheltered by our humanitarianism and our sense of justice, hold the incendiary torches ready, with nothing to stop the spread of their ideas except the critical reason of a single, fairly intelligent, mentally stable stratum of the population. One should not, however, overestimate the thickness of this stratum. It varies from country to country in accordance with national temperament. Also, it is regionally dependent on public education and is subject to the influence of acutely disturbing factors of a political and economic nature. Most people confuse self-knowledge with knowledge of their conscious ego personalities. Anyone who has ego consciousness at all takes it for granted that he knows himself, but the ego knows only its own contents, not the unconscious and its contents, People measure their self-knowledge by what the average person in their social environment knows of himself, but not by the real psychic facts which are for the most part hidden from them. In this respect, the psyche behaves like the body with its physiological and anatomical structure, of which the average person knows very little too. Okay, and commentary on that. I imagine that many who are listening or who may read this themselves, when they come across the subversive minority language sheltered by humanitarianism or sense of justice, will inevitably identify as the other. Certainly, that cannot, of course, mean me. And so it is that we perpetuate the notion that everything I do is, by definition, good, and anybody who does something opposite of what I believe or do must therefore be wrong. It is always the other person holding the incendiary torches ready. It is always the other person who is subversive and seeking to destroy what we, the humble masses, have built. It's not meant to be condescending. It's meant to be reflective of our tendency to assume the rightness of everything that we do and believe. And this is not about getting into whether or not what we do or believe is in fact right. It is about recognizing the thinking, the assumption that goes with it. Nobody holds an opinion without it being bound to the notion of it being correct or an accurate portrayal of reality. This is inevitable. What I'm speaking to is that belief itself, that understanding it means acknowledging the limitation that an assumption in the belief of one's rightness has for further questioning, for further inquiry, for change. Because as Jung points out, most people confuse self-knowledge with knowledge of their conscious ego personalities. We are so enamored of our speaking, so enraptured by our ability to name things, define, and tell stories, that we very rarely stop and question just whether or not and how those naming, those definitions, and those stories are limiting our ability to think outside of them. This is not about getting into some kind of rabid subjectivism where no truth is capable. This is about acknowledging the power of the human organism, the power of our mind to pick out what it is out of reality that supports the very intrinsically narrow story that we have about our relationship within it. Because there is so very much going on beneath the surface of any singular statement. There are entire worlds going on behind every protest, every emotionalistic statement, every meme, tweet, and personal commentary. And just as we blindly accept the way our bodies function until they don't function the way we want, so it is that quite often we do not question the substance of our conscious lives until it is too late, until we are face down in the muck of what we created because we were blinded by the fervency of our belief in our rightness. And we'll come back to the reading here. This is particularly true of theories which are based on statistics. The distinctive thing about real facts, however, is their individuality. Not to put too fine a point on it, one could say that the real picture consists of nothing but exceptions to the rule, and that, in consequence, absolute reality has predominantly the character of irregularity. These considerations must be borne in mind whenever there is talk of a theory serving as a guide to self-knowledge. There is and can be no self-knowledge based on theoretical assumptions, for the object of self-knowledge is an individual, a relative exception in an irregular phenomenon. Hence it is not the universal and the regular that characterize the individual, but rather the unique. He is not to be understood as a recurrent unit, but as something unique and singular, which in the last analysis can neither be known nor compared with anything else. At the same time, man, as a member of a species, can and must be described as a statistical unit. Otherwise, nothing general could be said about him. Scientific education is based, on the main, on statistical truths and abstract knowledge, and therefore imparts an unrealistic, rational picture of the world, in which the individual, as a merely marginal phenomenon, plays no role. The individual, however, as an irrational datum, is the true and authentic carrier of reality, the concrete man as opposed to the unreal ideal or normal man to whom the scientific statements refer. What is more, most of the natural sciences try to represent the results of their investigations as though these had come into existence without man's intervention, in such a way that the collaboration of the psyche, an indispensable factor, remains invisible. All right, and some thoughts on that. This very much is about levels of analysis, which, quite frankly, gets us into all sorts of trouble when we get into various dialogues with people. For so many, there will be started from a position of, well, facts are facts. And the assumption in that statement is usually that facts correspond to reality itself. That they, in many ways, kind of exist independent of the people who are finding them. That people play no role other than as players on the kind of a factual whack-a-mole, that the facts pop up and bam, yep, see, there it is. That was a fact. I hit it, identified it, that's what happened. When really, it's a little more complicated than that. It's not that facts in that sense don't exist. It's that facts exist that way and they exist within the human propensity to create stories, to create coherent narratives. And we find this most notably in statistics, in often scientific theories that go, this is humanity. And then they make some kind of general statement. And then you've got a whole bunch of people who go, but wait, there's all these outliers. And wait, I have a contrary story. Again, levels of analysis. Where are we starting? Are we starting at a level of description? Are we starting at a level of laying the groundwork for future individual conversations? Or are we starting at the level of the individual and then just simply assuming that we have a grasp of the general together? And that right there is where we often come into trouble. Because when we think we are simply reporting facts and assume then that this corresponds in a go past, skip over the human component, then we have assumed that ourselves and the other party are operating under the same general notion of what reality is, as if they share the same story we have. And nothing further can be from the truth. At the end of the day, we are definitely individuals, and we are definitely part of a species, just as facts are very much about corresponding to reality, even as they also are held within a coherent structure. You don't have one without the other, and a focus on one over the other creates all sorts of problems in understanding our own lives, but then how we relate to others and how they see the world. We mistake the truth of our statements for dictates of authority when we lose sight of the role our individual humanity plays in the construction of those statements. And of course, the opposite also poses its own problem, which we'll get into here shortly. And back to the reading. Slavery and rebellion are inseparable correlates. Hence, rivalry for power and exaggerated distrust pervade the entire organism from top to bottom. Furthermore, in order to compensate for its chaotic formlessness, a mass always produces a leader who almost infallibly becomes the victim of his own inflated ego consciousness, as numerous examples in history show. This development becomes logically unavoidable the moment the individual masses together with others and becomes obsolete. Okay, and commentary on that. This right here is the opposite problem. We have flipped the general and the individual so that the individual becomes on top. And we do this invariably. I mean, because the general is complicated. The general doesn't hold all of the individual facets of our lives. We hear things like job numbers. We hear things like racism, like privilege. And depending on our worldview, we immediately go to, but I'm the exception. That doesn't meet me where I'm at. And so then, to compensate, we gravitate together into our own echo chambers in the process in order to then find power. Those chambers produce an individual, yet again, who comes up and says, I will speak for you. This here is the process of government. We live our individual lives, find cohesion in group solidarity, and then in order to feel empowered that our previous sense of identity as individuals gave us, we then put our faith into a singular person from within the group to speak for us. But the problem here then is that person carries with them the collected ego of all who are supporting them. The person may start with the best of intention. The person may start with and firmly believe that they are there for and to empower the group that has brought them up. But nobody can withstand the overwhelming, engorged power of that group pushing to feel that their voice is heard. And it will lay down even the best of intentions. This brings us then to the difficulties of what we are faced now in our own democratic experiment. And to that we turn to our final reading. But that is just what is happening today. We are all fascinated and overawed by statistical truths and large numbers, and are daily apprised of the nullity and futility of the individual personality, since it is not represented and personified by any mass organization. Conversely, those personages who strut about on the world stage and whose voices are heard far and wide seem, to the uncritical public, to be borne along on some mass movement or on the side of public opinion, and for this reason are either applauded or execrated. Since mass suggestion plays the predominant role here, it remains a moot point whether their message is their own, for which they are personally responsible, or whether they merely function as a megaphone for collective opinion. Under these circumstances, it is small wonder that individual judgment grows increasingly uncertain of itself, and that responsibility is collectivized as much as possible, i.e., is shuffled off by the individual and delegated to a corporate body. In this way, the individual becomes more and more a function of society, which in its turn usurps the function of the real-life carrier, whereas in actual fact, society is nothing more than an abstract idea like the state. Both are hypostatized, that is, have become autonomous. The state in particular is turned into a quasi-animate personality from whom everything is expected. All right, and final commentary on that. While overtly, Jung's criticism here is focused on the assumed power of particular scientific disciplines, it is in fact the suppression of the importance of the individual that is at the heart of the point here. You see, our need to separate ourselves into ever smaller groups removes the importance of the individual. It suppresses human expression to what can fit into an easy-to-swallow label. This process of labeling away our humanity spreads from the immediate relationships of varying intimate bonds to that of the state, where we have over the decades replaced the power of the individual voter for the hope of a powerful leader. Every time we mash together a section of populace under the easy-to-swallow label, it encourages the ignoring of difference. It encourages the trimming away of the branches that humanity is made of. And the result, of course, then becomes what individual will then stand up and be heard. Well, then it becomes the individual that so embodies the label that the group falsely convinces itself that the person stands for them, when in fact they themselves have all manner of differences But we don't see that because we're so busy hoping that they will speak for us. Which is why, for so long now, that instead of the common citizen, the individual, running for office, we simply protest and scream for someone to lead us, for someone to be the next Messiah that we can bind ourselves to and move with, feel empowered again. So often now we are less concerned with actively engaging in making the world the way we'd like, and more concerned with wailing at how it isn't, and then lamenting that nothing changes. Change always occurs through the mechanism of relational bonds, but for change to be guided, it must be done so consciously and with attention to what is available. Else we are at the mercy of whoever takes up the reins we've cast off. It is not enough to merely think of what we want. We must act. It is not enough to merely cast out into the void our hope, our ideal. We must step into that same space and engage. We must delve into the mass of humanity. We must lift up the corners of our labels and find out what is underneath. We must determine whether or not the lids that we have placed on ourselves and those around us are hiding what we have long been missing. Every time that we feel the urge to give up our voice to another, it should encourage us to ask, what are we giving up? Whenever anybody says, I speak for you, we should immediately ask, and what is it do you think I stand for? And do you actually know my life? When we desire to label ourselves, to fight for a name, we should take a step back so that we do not become trapped in a narrow focusing on our shared humanity. We are at the end of this episode, and I encourage you now to, if you are able and it is safe to do so, close your eyes and join with me in a moment of mindful reflection. We do this because it helps remind us that we are more than any singular thought, more than any emotional reaction. We are all of those and everything yet to come. That we are each and every individual thought and emotion and all of them together. And with your eyes closed, just bring your attention to the breath, bringing the shoulders down. And with every exhalation, sink further into the moment. Sink further into the stillness that is the core of the self. Watch as the thoughts flit about, move on by. We do not need to be caught up in any one of them. We can simply observe, reflect, and move on. And when we do get caught up in one, we simply and calmly bring attention back to the breath. Feel the lungs expand and deflate. Feel our body move from tension to release. And our minds move from chaos to stillness. Continue pausing for a few more seconds. Okay, bring your attention back to the present. Open your eyes and take another deep breath, knowing that you have slowed down the maelstrom of your life, if only for a moment. I want to thank you for joining me again on this episode of Humanity's Values. If you desire to contact me, please do so at david.teachout@lifeweavings.org. You can also send me an email through a form that can be found at lifeweavings.org. Also at the website are numerous other articles exploring the individual, our role in society, relationships, politics, and also links for following me on Twitter and Facebook. Until next time, keep breathing, dwell in the moment, and find that stillness.